Hello, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And we're coming at you with another end of the year list video. This year, we are doing what we did last year as a sort of intermittent list video, where we talk about some of our favorite underappreciated albums of the year. Last time, we kind of talked about and focused on albums that weren't going to feature prominently in our end of the year list, and that, you know, we felt that that was a damn shame that there were so many records that we still wanted to talk about. So we wanted to kind of balance some releases that maybe didn't get as much attention, maybe we didn't initially get to cover, or that we just want to sort of re-emphasize our love for, just because a lot goes under the radar. We can't mention everything. So this is our sort of conceited effort to shout out as wide an array of things as humanly possible. So each of us have picked 10 records that we want people to be vigilant, look out for, listen to, just because they need more attention, or, you know, just because they might have a very broad appeal and they might make your end of the year list too before you make it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the thing is, as well, I think, and I'm pretty sure this is true of all the records on both of our lists, we didn't get to formally review either of these. And I don't think, or some of yours might have, but I don't think any of mine, or maybe my number one that I'm going to mention today might have, but I don't think any of mine made my top 10 of the year either, which is just a real testament to how fantastic that this year was. And I think also how well represented our best albums of the year video is going to be when that comes out. Like, that's just going to be a really joyful video to record, because there's just so many great albums this year that we were all basically just head over heels for. But yeah, I listened to basically more music that was released this year than I think I maybe had for any other year. I was just always having something on.
Same.
So I feel like particularly well qualified to be able to do this video. Whereas last year, while I'm very proud of that Overlooked Albums videos we did last year, I definitely was shouting out some albums that maybe weren't that overlooked, or that maybe I had talked about extensively already. Whereas today, I think I'm really confidently going to be talking about some albums that I think there's a good chance a decent handful of our listeners may not have heard of at all, and will also really, really enjoy. But Jake, why don't you kick us off this time with your number 10 pick for most overlooked albums of 2022?
Well, my number 10 here, I did a deep dive on this band to the point where I would now consider them one of my favorite working bands, period, and that being the stoner metal band Elder. Ever since the sort of turn of the decade, Elder has been cranking out insanely quality releases that sort of span the sort of really all-encompassing, like, there's stoner metal in their sound, but there's also sort of a heavy psych, proggy, psychedelic, doom metal, post-rock sort of. They are a band that have many facets. To me, Elder is a band that carry the torch of metal of this kind, that, like, Black Sabbath's initial run of records initially passed that off to, like, a band like Electric Wizard, and then Electric Wizard passed the torch to Elder in terms of these kinds of records. And this year we got the newest album from them, Innate Passage. And this album is another quality release from the band, but it's not just another quality release from the band. One of the things that I love about this band is that they really do kind of elaborate on their sound very distinctly with each of their records. With their sort of first genuine masterpiece, Deadroot Stirring, that's a very fundamentals stoner metal album. Then with 2015's Lore, they add a lot more proggier inclinations into that. And with my favorite release of theirs, Reflections of a Floating World, they get super ambitious and get even kind of post-rocky and huge and proggy on that. Omens kind of doubled down on the progginess and ends up being this really synth-heavy, really gorgeous sounding, like Steven Wilson tier prog produced project that, while it does abandon some of the core strengths of the band that left that album to be less well received, I still think holds a distinct kind of sway in their discography. So they come back with Innate Passage here, and they have an opportunity to sort of prove to everyone that they aren't in the middle of a slump or anything, because the last album wasn't received super duper well. And I think they do just that on here. Instead, this time they blend their heavy psych, stoner metal kind of proggy sound with space rock. And this is just a logical sort of extension of their sound for me. But what they do is they have 5 songs on here. There's a 50-minute runtime. And this is just a beautiful, dense, gorgeous album that is layered with the sort of synths of the last record, but it's sort of contained within a more tangible, heavy hitting space that space rock sound really adds a lot to. And it's just another dimension to this band's sound. It features one of the best heavy songs of the year. The song Merged in Dreams, I think, is an absolute highlight here, but I think everything on here is just up to the bar of quality that this band have set for themselves, which is exceptionally high. This is not to be missed by any fans of metal, fans of prog, fans of space rock, anything. The Elder are a band that have consistently gotten a little bit more of a following since Reflections of a Floating World back in 2017, which is where I hopped on with the band. And they are just, again, they're one of the most consistent bands in metal, and Innate Passage is nothing but a testament to that claim, and I highly recommend it.
My number 10, so one of the things I've tried to capture with my 10 picks today is I've tried to capture 10 picks that are all musically very distinct from one another. In fact, I've tried to, as much as I can anyway, pick records from different genres for each of my spots on this list without compromising on, the actual albums that I want to celebrate. So this year has been such a great year for music of such eclectic varieties that this really wasn't very hard to do. And my number 10 pick is an album that is an exciting fusion of 2 very distinct, different genres with very distinct and different histories that ultimately align in really fascinating ways. It's not exactly it's not a record that particularly captures the complexity and the progressive innovation of these genres at their height, but it kind of forces these 2 distinct genre poles to meet in the middle somewhere for something that is really immediate and captivating and really just a tour de force for the main musical contributors involved. This record I'm talking about is the new album from the Comet is Coming, Hyperdimensional Expansion Beam, which is a fusion of modern jazz and electronic dance music. First of all, a pivot for not only for modern jazz necessarily, not very much of which is all that influenced by EDM, but certainly a pivot for the Comet is Coming themselves, whose last album, Trust in the Life Force of the Deep Mystery, was a gorgeous, more psychedelic jazz exercise that remains, I think, one of the best jazz albums of the last few years. But Hyperdimensional Expansion Beam, in really emphasizing the contributions of synthesizer and keyboard player Danalog, as well as the front and center virtuosic saxophone playing of King Chewbacca Hutchings himself, really allows this band to go into a new, exciting direction that feels very much, while stylistically quite different from the space rock, psychedelic, new jazz stylings of their last album, feels very much in keeping with that restless, genre-innovating, progressive spirit that this project have always embodied. And honestly, the first time I heard this, I was a little underwhelmed by it. I felt that Chewbacca's, the absolute intensity and power of what Chewbacca could do was maybe not fully capitalized on as much. But I will say, I've come back to this record time and again a few times over the last few months. And each time I come back to it, I begin to appreciate what it's doing for what it is, as opposed to missing the complexity or whatever of jazz as I'm used to experiencing it. The thing about Hyperdimensional Expansion Beam is that, yes, it is not a particularly complex album in terms of the arrangements or in terms of the performances. In fact, a lot of the time, what Shabaka is doing is essentially hitting on one or two notes over and over and over and over and over, essentially, and iterating that in a very primitive dance style, basically. But there's so much power in the performances here, and there is so much momentum in the arrangements themselves and the interplay between the members of this band that I'm never less than completely captivated. And particularly how exciting and original and novel this fusion of sounds is, even for this band, makes it feel particularly exciting. And rather than being a sidestep, which I think was how I initially viewed it when it came out, it legitimately does, in retrospect, feel like a step forward for an act who seem at this point basically committed to making records that are new and exciting exercises in genre that are completely different each time they approach laying down an LP. And Hyperdimensional Expansion Beam, through that lens, is an immensely satisfying experience. It may be even the most immediate project that Shabaka has been involved in that I've heard anyway up until this point. There is just something so intense and exciting and vital about the pulse of this thing throughout its entire runtime, especially on tracks like the 1-2 punch of Code and Technicolor that open the record, the brightest, the most vibrant, the most intense, the most high BPM stuff here, but also tracks like Angel of Darkness as well, Pyramids, which could easily be a radio single if you had a bit more of, if you had a lyrical presence and maybe a little bit more fine tuning of some of the composition. Atomic Wave Dance, the closer Mystic. There is so much on this record that feels very immediately satisfying and captivating while also rewarding your patience as well. I think if you go into this as a jazz listener who wants to hear, particularly wild and unconventional, experiments in modality and all those kinds of things, you might not get what you're looking for. But if you have an open mind, or if you're not necessarily normally even a jazz listener, you might find this to be a really exciting and intriguing release. And I think it continues to maintain both Shabaka as a performer, but particularly Comet is Coming as an act, as being one of the forefronts of modern jazz. Absolutely essential listening. That's my number 10.
My number 9 is going to be the debut album from an artist named Caroline Loveglow, her debut album, Strawberry. And Caroline Loveglow, she's sort of an artist who's been putting out some music, and I believe got a bit of a cosign in the form of a single remix by George Clanton, which will definitely tell you a lot about the sound palette that she's working with here, because Strawberry feels like a sort of dream pop, neo-psych blend of sounds that is, very familiar sounding, very similar to, I think, the Hatchie album from this year, with a distinct blend of really breezy kind of chill wave sounds that, again, are found on stuff like George Clanton album, for example. And what we have here is 8 really tight tracks. This is an album that's 24 minutes, considerably shorter than some of the EPs that we talked about. But this is an album that I listened to, and I was really into the sound of it first, and I was just like, yeah, this I'm into this. I like this. But it is so eminently re-listenable. I just kept coming back to it over and over and over again. And these songs, despite being pretty tight, pretty brief, most of them are, around like the exact 3-minute mark. Not exactly the same absolutely wondrously masterfully handled flow that an Always album might have, but it's certainly not a million miles away from it in terms of how I think this project ebbs and flows. It's 24 minutes total, so I think that gives you a good idea as to like the sort of breezy vibe that this kind of thing has. And it also, if you give it a shot, you're not going to regret too much of your time being spent if you don't really get that deeply into it. But this has been something I've gone back to over and over again, just because it's really, really fun. I think the coolest thing about this project is just how dense and how beautiful the sound actually is. And the fact that it's all self-produced. Like, this is all her, complete, like a real definitive statement, sort of proof of concept for her sound that I really think could be developed into something that could be truly like innovative or groundbreaking if she, you know, takes it up a notch in terms of ambition in her next project. But what we have here is still something that feels like a splash of cool water on a hot summer day. This is a really great like driving album. I've put this on several times. The air conditioning in my car was broken this year, so I did many drives around the city in which I live in with the windows all down so that the breeze could come in, and 9 out of 10 times this song was playing during it. Just very much added to the very summery kind of vibe. It's very bright, it's very pretty. I can't exactly say that this will be a project that's going to last with a whole lot of people, just because it feels like it's almost designed from the ground up to be kind of breezy, and you know, you just might not be into it. But to me, it feels like stuff like the Hatchie project, but it's boiled down to nothing but its highlights, its most essential moments, and then just sort of distilled into this very tight experience. So give this a shot if this sounds appealing to you. I can't imagine that this would be something that anybody would deem like unworthy of their time, just because it does feel like a properly dense experience. The production here is far from some lightweight shit, but I've listened to this maybe 10-20 times over the course of the summer, and it was just something that I really enjoyed coming back to over and over again.
My number 9 pick. Now, Jake, I know because I've seen your list in advance that you're going to be shouting out a lot of metal today. So one of the things that I wanted to do as a kind of counterpoint, and also as a part of my personal desire to like cover as many genres as possible with my picks, I'm only going to shout out one metal release in my list today, and with the caveat that it was a very fantastic year for metal of many different stripes, as Jake will demonstrate. But the one metal album I want to shout out in terms of being particularly overlooked, actually it's kind of 2 albums technically, because this band put out 2 records this year. It is, of course, the legendary New York black metal band Krallice, who came back this year with 2 records. I particularly am fond of the first of them, January's Crystalline Exhaustion, which felt like a complete new step from when I had last checked in with Krallice, which admittedly was a long time ago. Their 2012 classic Years Past Matter. But they have completely evolved their sound and moved into something that is much more atmospheric, that is much more kind of integrative of non-metallic influences. I think more so. I mean, they've always been a kind of progressive black metal band in terms of like having dynamic approaches to genre, but here I think in their newer iteration, this is truer than ever before. The focus is very much on soundscapes and arrangements of instrumentation, as opposed to, you know, pummeling riffs and that kind of traditional stock aspects of black metal. There's a little bit of space rock in here. There's a little bit of technical black metal in certain places as well. It's a very diverse and intriguing and exciting experience, and it absolutely deserves your time, particularly the fantastic 10-minute opener Frost and the colossal 14-minute closer, the title track, both of which I think showcase the metallic strengths of Krallice really well, but also have this heavily atmospheric and frequently not even metallic at all sections that really do add a bit more weight and add a bit more of a kind of progressive bent to their sound. So yeah, absolutely highly recommend that. They put out a second record later in the year called Psychagogue as well, which is also very good. I mean, basically the equal of Crystalline Exhaustion, really. It just doesn't have quite the same novelty for me, and I haven't listened to it as much. But it is also worth hearing. You could probably actually get a fairly satisfying experience out of just doing these back to back and treating it like a double record. Psychagogue is much more, I think it's a bit heavier overall. It's a bit more avant-garde. It's a bit more sort of structurally loose than Crystalline Exhaustion is, and the pieces in general are much longer overall on average than that record, but together they showcase a restlessly innovative, band who are also a band that have been around for a very long time, that have a very high pedigree and a great level of respect in the black metal community as well. So if you want a taste of that, my recommendation is check out what Krallice have been up to this year.
My next entry is going to be a sort of dual pick here because this is two releases from one artist. That being an artist I've gotten really into because of one of their new releases at least, that being the electronic music artist Death's Dynamic Shroud. I want to shout out two of their major albums from this year, not their only two albums, but two of their major albums from this year. The first of which being Transcendence Bot. The second of which being, of course, their incredibly acclaimed release, Darklife. But Transcendence Bot was sort of the one that I got on board with initially, just because I found their just strange combination of vaporwave, kind of glitchy art pop and plunderphonics to create a kind of cyber metal to be incredibly compelling. Their songs on this, like To Be Human, which are just these electro-industrial fucking bangers with incredible vocal hooks that just stick with you long after you initially hear them. And this whole record has like a seamless flow to it, but it also has songs that are less on the heavy side and more on the pop side. One of the best songs of the year that didn't make my list, but on a lesser year probably would have, being the song Over Again, which is a remix of the Katy Perry song from her most recent album, Never Over. A great pop song, incidentally. But this remix of it, I think, is sort of the final form version of it. And it's just an insanely creative, imaginative, very unexpectedly uplifting release that feels like it has a real arc to it. You really start in this kind of grimier, industrial kind of, just like, there are lots of evocations of body horror and existentialism on this, and then it sort of takes you to a more centralized, more emotional, brighter place by the end of it. And then I could say something similar about Darklife, which is just a staggering release, honestly. This is a 65-minute long epic that all of the members of this project, Death's Dynamic Shroud, consists of three prominent musicians, James Webster, Tech Honors, and Keith Rankin. And this is sort of like an Animal Collective thing where sometimes they will release solo projects. Sometimes two of them will collaborate. Sometimes, they'll have like bits and pieces. But this is one of the first, it might be the first project where all three of them are collaborating at the same time, which is what made it a very notable release. And this is just everything that is cool about this project and that feels quintessentially modern in the world of like DIY electronic music. This is just an amazingly consistent, incredibly fun, just sensationally ballistic album that I've gotten so much enjoyment out of. It really feels like this album just sort of obeys its own rules in terms of musical construction and becomes something that's unlike anything else I've heard all year. The run of Stay through Light Left the Garden is one of the best multiple track runs on any album this year. They're just so great at creating such a large epic sound that can devolve into a Prince style sort of breakdown, like with these like really kind of sexy sounding guitars, or there's sort of the hazy sort of art pop of songs like Before I Cool Off, which has like one of the best title drops of any album this year. There's ambitious narrative tracks like Mesa D E102, which is like this post-apocalyptic vision of artificial intelligence overtaking the world. There's just everything, and the kitchen sink is on this album, and somehow these guys make all of it work. And it could come across as a mess to some people, certainly. But the more I've listened to this, the more I've just really fallen in love with it. I love the scope. I love the ambition. I love the singularity. And it does have, again, it has a really uplifting arc to it. It's strange to say about music like this, but there are like tangible themes about isolation and identity and coming to grips with just sort of yourself and being yourself. And I think it has a really just sort of wholesome place that it ends the album in that was really nice this year. It was cool to sort of see this kind of like a message I would classify as being almost transhumanist in nature be expressed on an album like this is just so interesting and unique and fun. And I highly recommend it if you haven't heard it, just to have an opinion on it in general. Death Dynamic Shroud are a project I never would have expected myself to get into, but the more I delve into their back catalog, the more I'm just endlessly fascinated with what they bring to the table.
All right, for my number 8 pick, we move from the world of metal in my last pick and the world of just what however you describe Death Dynamic Shroud, to something that's firmly in my ballpark, emo pop. And we talk about a band from Florida called Pool Kids. Now, this was a very, very recent discovery of mine. I made it a point in the last couple of weeks to try and get some of those blind spots that I missed throughout the year in case there was anything that I would just fall in love with. And lo and behold, there are, and this is one of them. The new album from Pool Kids, it is self-titled. It's their second album, following 2018's fantastically titled Music to Practice Safe Sex To, which has such amazing song titles as $5 Subtweet and They Only Care About My Fills and Not My Feels. And that kind of gives you an idea of the sense of humor of this band. They're obviously very hyper modern, and they're very much like, zillennial type individuals talking about very much the experience of being online. But they have such a sense of humor, and most importantly, such an incisive and great talent for amazing hooks and really punchy songwriting that you are never even momentarily questioning any of the artistic decisions that these guys make. Pool Kids, now I almost feel like even 2 or 3 months from now, I might love this even more. I'm in the process that you sometimes get of when you're falling in love with a record, and it's really happening for me with this new Pool Kids album. They've been co-signed by Paramore, and that is a meaningful co-sign because when I listen to this, Paramore are the first band that I think of. They're this really punchy emo pop band that are firmly working within an aesthetic that's well established that bands like Paramore and bands like Jimmy Eat World to a certain extent as well have mined millions out of. And the thing about this band is that, like Paramore, they live or die essentially on the charisma of their front woman, Christine Goodwin. And boy, does she have charisma. She is such an infectious and funny writer as well. She's really great at capturing the, it's nothing profound or anything like that. I mean, far from it. I mean, this is the opposite of profound. It's very much like, teenage to early 20s kind of observations about being lonely as fuck and being pissed off at Twitter and all this kind of shit. And it feels very refreshing and also kind of captivating and like cathartic almost to hear someone expressing these things without trying to mine any kind of profound observations out of them. A lot of the time, these songs just basically boil up to, I'm sad as fuck and I hate this person for making me sad and I wish that I could leave this group chat, but I can't. And that's kind of the vibe of the whole album. And it's like, it's really just, it's funky, it's fun, it's just cool as hell. There is a lyrical passage on, speaking of group chats, there's a lyrical passage on the song Arm's Length where Christine's like, I'm in a group chat with 21 goddamn people. I wish I was exaggerating, but I'm not. My phone crashes 37 times a day, but it's nice to have friends. Sometimes
Jesus
it's nice to
Christ.
be left on red. Wait, no, it's not. I think I'm taking things too personally. When did I get so sensitive? And she goes through these rambling kind of like personal crises, while at the same time never losing control of these incredibly tightly wound songs. I mean, the hooks on here are just sensational, and it very much has the same appeal as it doesn't really sound anything like these artists, and I'm definitely being a bit baity by even bringing them up, but it has the same kind of appeal as, you know, the kind of boy genius crowd, particularly someone like Lucy Dacus, I think, who can like talk about, you know, who can make observations about living in the moment essentially, and can tell these kind of character-based stories, but can that just instantly pull you in. Although these are certainly not character-based stories on this album. Christine is firmly speaking in the first person across this entire album. It opens with an absolute rager in one of the best breakup songs I've heard this year, called Conscious Uncoupling. Hilarious title and reference there. I mean, that song and album essentially just opens up about like with someone like taking a deep breath that they'll never have to encounter their ex's annoying parents again. And it's just like immediately you are just with this really specific observation, I was immediately just captured. I mean, this definitely came at a certain point in my year where it was basically bound to grab me. But that's the thing, like the record is so funny and so wry and so punchy and so cool that I am just never less than completely charmed by it. I think that Pool Kids are a great band. I think if you want something that is going to give you something really punchy, something quite irreverent, something that is like certainly emo, but not like in a way that's going to make you feel tired, but in a way that's going to make you feel, you know, like Jimmy Eat World do, or like Riot era Paramore did, you know, that kind of thing is exactly what you're going to get out of Pool Kids. And of course, because it's an emo pop record in this vein, it does end with an incredibly sad, self-loathing ballad called Pathetic, essentially, that you kind of have to have at the final stretch. But yeah, whole album is fantastic. Love it. Continuing to grow on me. I want to go back and check out their debut, and I think that it's not been an amazing year for emo, as Ian Cohen on IndieCast observed recently. And also, I should be honest and cop to the fact that he's the reason I even am aware of this band in the first place. But still, if you want something that is not going to drag you down too much, that is going to offer some relatable insights that are very, very 2022, but without leaning into some of the worst tendencies of that we kind of talked a little bit about in our worst albums of the year video, you can't get much better than Pool Kids, in my opinion. Great album. And that's my number 8 pick.
My next pick on here is a sort of album that was kind of destined to be overlooked because it was released so early on in the year. That being the album Dissolution Wave by Cloakroom. And this album is this really unique combination of shoegaze and space rock and slowcore, and also a bit of an alt country bent at times. It's very, very meditative. It's very atmospheric. There are sort of like more dense, kind of noisier moments that kind of remind me of stuff like the Slow Dive, self-titled on stuff like Lost Meaning or the title track. But I really find that this album hits its more unique strengths past those initial songs once it gets into those more slow, kind of dense places, because this is not the first time we are going to compliment the production of one Mr. Will Yip. It is also not going to be the last time we are going to compliment the production of one Mr. Will Yip. Considering he will have produced some of the albums on our end of the year list, but again, look forward to that. But this here is an album that just, again, it sounds fucking fantastic. I love the vocal performances from frontman Doyle Martin on songs like Doubts, again, really adding that kind of folksy bent to this that really unexpectedly works really, really well. There is sort of like a narrative concept to this, in that being it's like from the point of view of like a space miner from the future. And that's a very silly kind of high concept thing, but it adds a sort of grounding to the lyrical content here, which I find really fascinating and really evocative. It's a great tight, less than 40-minute long listen that I've come back to over and over again. It's just a great, relaxing, enveloping album. It's not going to sort of captivate you in the way of a lot of like more hard-hitting, fast-moving shoegaze like My Bloody Valentine or earlier Slow Dive or Ride might. But if you want something to just sort of fully lose yourself in a kind of really unique sound from a band that I think really have a chance at going places if they take the things that make their sound unique and sort of really further emphasize them on later releases. So get it on the ground floor, listen to Dissolution Wave. I bought this album on CD. No regrets. Again, a great car ride album. Super unique, super fun. Highly recommend.
Awesome. Right. Now, here's a cool thing that doesn't get to happen very often is that I get to shout out a Kentucky-based artist that I don't think Jake has heard. I shouted this artist out a little briefly early in the year, but I only had listened to this particular record once at that point, so I hadn't really had the time to live with it a little bit. But I have become, very recently, I have become very taken with the music of the Kentucky-born and currently Germany-based singer-songwriter and indie folk artist Chad Metheny, who makes records under the name Emperor X. And Emperor X released an album called The Lakes of Zones B and C in April of this year. I was turned onto this by our friend Connor, who was turned onto this by Not Real Music, another great YouTube music review channel that I wanted to shout out as well. I've been watching a lot of their reviews this year. And so Connor and Ryan of Not Real Music are both people that I trust when they recommend something, because they don't recommend stuff or rate stuff highly very easily. Like, it has to be something that really captivates them and offers something really original and new. And what's interesting about Emperor X is that they're not particularly original or new, and they don't particularly do things you can't get elsewhere. In fact, in every attempt I've had to try and describe this record, I've inevitably fallen on reference points. You know, it sounds like Ben Gibbard. It sounds like John Darnielle of the Mountain Goats. It sounds like Say Anything. It's kind of a weird amalgam of all of these things. Most of all, probably the Mountain Goats. I think if you're a fan of the Mountain Goats, you'll really enjoy Chad's songwriting. You'll really enjoy what Emperor X offers. But it's also like the Mountain Goats with a little bit of the kind of like swingy, kind of folky, indie rocky, vaguely emo, but not fully there stuff that, you know, something like Say Anything offers as well. But I mean, forget all the comparison points. It's just really, really great songwriting. It's really captivating songwriting. It's really funny songwriting. It's occasionally very poignant songwriting as well. You have tracks like Freeway in Heaven, Communists and Luxury, the anthem of the Greater McMurdo Station Chamber of Commerce, and the incredible closing track Stars, that all offer really sharp, really punchy, really hooky, and really charismatic singer-songwriter, you know, songs. Essentially, like, there's a little bit of Neutral Milk Hotel in here. There's a little bit of basically every indie folk, indie rock band of the last 20 years. But Chad has such a personality of his own, and he's such a really pointed and very talented writer that you never feel like you're listening to anything that's a pale imitation in any way. In fact, I would say that Chad's lyricism and songwriting is the biggest draw here. He's able to turn these songs into really catchy and hook-laden pieces, but ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm always really taken by how wittily he's able to make these acerbic observations about, for instance, the hypocrisies of fringe political movements or war and politics. And even in a song like Stars, which is the closing track here, just this absolutely, I mean, it almost brought a tear to my eye listening to it this morning, this pure-hearted humanist anthem where the chorus is just basically, you don't ever have to justify a person, which is like one of my favorite lyrics of the year. And Chad's just really great at capturing little ideas or thoughts like that he doesn't write to be profound, but that really imprint themselves on you. Like I said as well, it's really funny, it's really irreverent, it's got a kind of tongue-in-cheek aspect to it, especially songs like False Medal, which opens with the line, I wrote a song about boxing, but I'm better at avoiding a fight. I never gave or received a punch, and I'm singing songs about freedom on the cheapest PA I could find. He's very direct. He's very like hard on sleeve, but also in a way where he has this sort of self-awareness, so he never kind of oversteps into being cloying. Rohava Punks, the second song on here as well, feels very kind of like Transcendental Youth era Mountain Goats-esque to me. It just has that sort of sense of character, and both within the performance, but also in the sense that it is telling a story about distinct characters that you come to really feel close to by the end of the song, even though it's almost just an incidental kind of novelty track in a certain way. Communists and Luxury, which I mentioned before as well. One of the songs on the record that feels the most current, that offers the most kind of witty commentary on the way in which sort of fringe political movements kind of play out, or the way in which people kind of view themselves politically through the lens of the different social machines that they have to communicate through. I think there's a lot of really funny and incisive observations there. Freeway in Heaven just has one of the most catchiest hooks of the year, and yeah, it's actually a really short record. It's only 32 minutes long. It doesn't waste a moment. It's absolutely one of the year's most beguiling and exciting singer-songwriter records, and I can't recommend it enough to anyone who even vaguely enjoys anything that I've mentioned in this little segment. A really, really captivating release, and I look forward to diving deeper into Chad's back catalog and seeing what he releases in the future, because I mean, this fucking thing only has about 100 ratings on Rate Your Music, and presumably even fewer elsewhere. So, God, give this guy's music a listen. He absolutely deserves to be bigger than he is.
My next pick on here is we're getting back on board the atmospheric black metal train with a Ukrainian-based black metal band called White Ward, their new album, False Light. And as far as atmospheric black metal albums go, this is easily one of the most unique. The genre blends here are just really ambitious. I mean, the most notable of which is the incorporation of jazz, labeled very funnily on Rate Your Music as dark jazz. The inclusion of a saxophone on this album is a very distinct tonality that you're not probably used to hearing on an album like this. But there is also a combination of that with atmospheric black metal, but with post-metal, with prog metal, to the point where this sounds like all kinds of different metal albums, but also no other kinds of metal albums, to the point where it's an experience that's just very, very singular. And if nothing else, this is an album worth sticking around for the incredible highlights. The opening track, the monolithic 13-minute long Leviathan, is an absolute showstopper in terms of metal this year, and a huge highlight that's totally one of the best songs of the year in my opinion.
Great song.
And it's just like this insanely ambitious, insanely sprawling, really hard-hitting, but also really melodic atmospheric black metal that you don't often hear. I would say that this is comparable to something like Panopticon in some instances, but it also is a little bit more instrumentally varied, and it also has a kind of post-metal vibe that honestly reminded me a lot of Swans in places. There's a vocalist on here that sounds uncannily like Michael Gira, that goes by the name of Vitaly Havrilenko. His voice is that kind of really sort of drawling, sort of deep baritone voice that often sounds very like it works in a way, but it's like it's very disharmonious and kind of abrupt feeling whenever the vocals do show up. But this is just some of the most interesting, some of the best produced metal of the year from a band that are just super duper unique, that employ a litany of really talented musicians to create a product that I don't really think I've heard anything sound wholly like. And this isn't even the only album of theirs that like is worth hearing. Their 2019 album Love Exchange Failure is supposed to be really great as well, so I'm going to keep this band on my radar from here on out, just because after hearing the incredible combination of sounds on this album, I simply cannot ignore them. The title track, the penultimate song, the basically all of the really like 10-minute plus songs on this album are just some of the best things you're going to hear all year in heavy music. Certainly not for everyone, just because it is very idiosyncratic, but if you're somebody who likes there to be a certain spice in your atmospheric black metal, look no further than right here. If you were disappointed that that new Panopticon album didn't end up dropping this year, I have a feeling this will scratch that particular itch quite well.
My number 6 pick on my list is, so we're talking about overlooked records. I mean, this is certainly not an overlooked artist. I mean, this is one of the biggest artists in their niche ever. One of the tent poles of progressive electronic music dating all the way back to the 70s. I am talking about Tangerine Dream, who returned early this year with the album Raum. Now, of course, the sad circumstances which have kind of precipitated the lessening of releases from Tangerine Dream over recent years is, of course, the fact that founding member Edgar Froese died in 2015. And this album is the first record they've released since then that features music he worked on, essentially. They have been prolific as hell with odds and ends and random releases and stuff, but nothing has really stood out in a long time. And a big part of that has been how fractured the involvement of core members of Tangerine Dream has been, which you would expect. I mean, this is a band that go back about, fucking 50 years, if not more, which is why it's all the more stunning that they've put out an album in 2022, which I think, if not being as good, or if not standing up on the same pedestal as their peak material in the mid to late 70s, absolutely stands as by far one of the best things that they've done since then, and probably the best thing that they've released since they did the score to Thief by Michael Mann at the very least. So this new record, Raum, it's a kind of a revelation, to be honest. It's not really progressive electronica in any of the same senses as their 70s material. It's much more kind of down-tempo, standard, modern electronica with a little bit of IDM tinges to it. But man, the synth sounds on this album are massive. The general tones on this record are huge. It's invigorated. It feels layered and fresh and kinetic, and it feels vibrant in a way that I just frankly was not expecting. When I tried this out, I was thinking, oh, Tangerine Dream, probably 50 years on, are just doing, bog standard synthesizer, go burr ambient music. Boy, was I wrong. This album is enormous, especially when you have songs like the 17-minute Into 5/6 Zyken, which is absolutely the standout track here, by the way, as well. An absolutely massive progressive electronic synthesizer orgasmic journey, essentially, through some of the most gorgeous textures that I've heard on an electronic record in some time. Equally, you have the massive 15-minute title track that closes it out as well, that offers similar joys. I mean, one of the things that I appreciate most about this is that you don't really have anything all that inessential or even all that brief on this thing. It's a 70-minute record with only 7 tracks, so you get to spend a good amount of time luxuriating in these spaces, and it feels so exciting in a way that I don't think I would expect any Tangerine Dream record to feel, really, because at best, those albums are not exciting. They are warm and enveloping, and they take you to certain places that feel texturally satisfying, but I never really expect to go into a Tangerine Dream record and get something that is this vivacious, this full of energy, this full of life and light. It is such a radiant album, and I cannot recommend it enough. I don't even care if you're not all that familiar with early Tangerine Dream. I mean, this is a million miles away from it anyway, so it might as well be a different project entirely. But knowing that some of the key minds behind some of those earlier records were involved here, even if it is still very much a product of their later era lineup, if incorporating some work that Edgar Froese had contributed to before his death, it's stellar. It's a really, really good record that I have come back to time and again while writing, while gaming, while working, while doing all sorts of things, and it always kind of lights up the pleasure centers of my brain in a way that feels particularly nice to get from a legacy act this far into their career. So yeah, Tangerine Dream's Raum, check it out.
Next up on my list is, yet again, more atmospheric black metal. But this is once again a particular sect of atmospheric black metal that I think is really, really unique, and that being the band Blut aus Nord, the French black metal band, their latest release, which is Disharmonium, Undreamable Abysses. And they are a black metal band that goes back all the way to the mid 90s. They've been doing this for a while and have a number of really acclaimed releases. And I just sort of discovered this on complete happenstance and listened to it. And it ended up being something I went back to over and over again this year, just because it is 46 minutes long, 7 tracks. It's really, really just sort of easily designed to be consumed. As much as atmospheric black metal can be, but it also has a real avant-garde sort of occasional dark ambient bent to it that really emphasizes the atmosphere and atmospheric black metal. Some of the drumming on this is just absolutely absurd, but it's woven into the sort of tapestry of the production of these tracks very seamlessly, to the point where nothing really sticks out at you. You have to kind of listen to it very intently to pick up on what they're doing. But in that sort of seamless blend, it makes for this really, really cohesive, really, really just kind of enrapturing experience that I found myself really taken with. The sort of art on this album is a very kind of camp Lovecraftian sort of vibe that this gives off. Songs like, Chants of the Deep Ones, Tales of the Old Dreamers, harkening back to stuff like Lovecraft. And you really get that sort of Lovecraftian style kind of scale from a lot of this music that feels really immersive, really tangible. And it's just a really, really fascinating album from people who have been doing this for a really long time. And above all else, they just sort of put the vibes front and center, which is sort of really different for a lot of atmospheric black metal bands. They never sort of slack when it comes to any of their like instrumental tones or the actual playing. Like, all of it's obviously really proficient, it's obviously really skilled, but in a way where everyone feels very communicative. It's not about showing off, it's about blending into the wider tapestry of what's going on. And I just found this to be really, really awesome. This is a band that I think is well deserving of a deep dive from anyone who likes music like this. And so far, this is probably my favorite release from the band. I know our friend Pokegem also has a co-sign on this album in particular, and I just really recommend it if any of these things sound even remotely applicable to your music taste.
Hell yeah. For my number 5 pick, I mean, it might be a stretch to call this overlooked. I think it is within like proper hip hop head and also some critical circles a fairly celebrated release from this year. But I do feel that having come out so early in the year as well, and kind of having been overshadowed a bit by higher profile releases, some of the love and adoration that this record was getting in certain circles when it's come out has kind of, I think, not faded away, but I think it just really needs to be re-emphasized how good this album is. And that is the new album from Conway the Machine, God Don't Make Mistakes. Conway, of course, being one of the stalwarts of Griselda Records alongside Westside Gunn, Benny the Butcher, Mac Homie, Boldy James, a number of other artists who've all released projects under Griselda. But Conway, along with Benny and Westside Gunn, is one of the kind of the trifecta of kingpins of that label and of that collective, essentially. And Conway, I think, is maybe an artist who up until this point didn't have as much cultural cachet or wasn't maybe as well known as Benny and Westside was. And I kind of think that a lot of that was people just kind of waiting for Conway to make his masterpiece. I mean, 2020's From King to a God was pretty well celebrated and was heralded, I think, as a big step forward for Conway, who up until that point, I think most people knew for the mixtapes that he put out throughout the mid 2010s, particularly the ones he put out in 2018, but also mainly his features on records, particularly Westside Gunn albums and other artists' records as well. He was always a really strong standout features artist, but we were all waiting for Conway to essentially make the record that would define him. And I think that God Don't Make Mistakes is inarguably that record. I mean, Conway, as you learn when you delve into his story and as he recounts throughout this record, Conway has had a fucking difficult life. Conway has been through a lot of shit. Conway has been close to death a number of times. Conway has lost children. Conway has lost loved ones. Conway has gone through a lot. And in a lot of ways, God Don't Make Mistakes is his record documenting that. I mean, the centerpiece song is a song Stressed, where he essentially for 5 minutes straight raps about all the shit that he's gone through, and including like the things that I've said, like essentially suffering from brain damage as a result of being shot, losing his infant son in his arms, really horrific, traumatic things that he has been through. And he talks about them in detail on this album. And one of the most powerful aspects of the record is what a definitive and unambiguous statement of the importance, essentially, of not suppressing that trauma, especially among, masculine figures in the hip hop community and in the Black community more widely. Conway has come to kind of be a spokesperson with this record for how important it is to principally reduce the Black suicide rate as well, but also to just increase the ability of Black men in particular to speak about and deal with the things that they often, due to various cultural taboos and all sorts of things, keep suppressed, and also to feel a sense of triumph and strength for having survived and made it through, and not necessarily glorifying or glamorizing the trauma that led to that. And so Conway is very much all about those themes and those ideas across this record. A lot of it as well, you really root for him because he is talking about not only the tumultuous effect that these things that he's been through have had on him as well, but also how he has really fought essentially to establish himself as an artist as well. So much of his life has not only been overcoming the shit that he's gone through, but also trying to really put his name forward and be seen not just as another aspect of Griselda or as a great features artist, but as a human being with his own artistic drive. I mean, this is really, I think, quite potently felt on the song So Much More, essentially, where he's rapping again and again, and he makes a whole hook around basically how he doesn't want to be put in a box because he's so much more than that. He's so much more than another rapper. He's so much more than even the stories he tells. He's so much more than the ways in which he is defined and the things that he is defined by. I mean, to be fair, the things that I have defined him by almost in a certain sense, and introducing him here. So, Conway is really stepping out. He's really putting himself out there. He is acting vulnerable. He's acting powerful as well. It's not just a record of weepy sadness and trauma. It is a record of confidence. It is a record of assuredness. And so much of it feels like a breath of fresh air in a hip-hop landscape that is increasingly making time for these kinds of statements, but still maybe not as much as it could, and maybe something that not many huge artists within sort of hip-hop head spheres are really taking the time to elaborate on. So it's huge. It's a big, important record. It's one of the best hip-hop albums of the year, and if you haven't checked it out yet, it really deserves your attention. And I mean, if you don't think that it's an overlooked album of the year because it is fairly celebrated, then I'll have this place to be Conway the Machine in general as an overlooked artist who it seems is finally rising to the occasion and getting the shine that he deserves above and beyond how he has contributed to Griselda and all sorts of other things. Conway's great, and this is one of the best hip-hop records of the year, certainly one of the most essential hip-hop records of the year, and absolutely on my list with a bullet. Didn't doubt it for a second. This album is really great.
Next on my list is an album from a band I've gotten really, really into over the course of the last year. That is, I recommend this with avid enthusiasm, but I also do so hesitantly just because this band is clearly not for everyone, because this is the latest release from psychedelic drone folk band Current 93. And this is their album, If a City is Set Upon a Hill. And I don't really know what's up with this band these days or anything, but this just seems to have dropped relatively unceremoniously with no real formal announcement, with no like it just seems to have happened and existed and sort of was on streaming and Soulseek and then eventually on the band's Bandcamp with no real like fanfare whatsoever. And so I feel like that's part of the reason that a lot of people haven't listened to it, just because, again, fans of this band are still pretty active. Their last major release, The Light Is Leaving Us All, in 2018, did get a fairly good reception from a whole lot of people. But this release has gone sort of undersold, I think, from even fans of this band. Just because not a lot of people know that it even exists in the first place. And it's a damn shame because I genuinely think this is one of the best releases from this band to maybe get into them. But at the same time, it's also best appreciated from having a more holistic view of the band in general, just sort of knowing what makes this band unique and special and what makes this release special. But in a sense, this is a very traditionally beautiful sounding neo-folk, psychedelic folk, chamber folk release. It's not particularly long, unlike a lot of other Current 93 albums, which run north of an hour, which have a lot more, again, drone, ambient, lots of avant-garde stuff that is just very unfriendly to new listeners. I think even the best albums from this band, albums that I love deeply, are albums that I can't wholeheartedly recommend to people, even people who are into this weirder music, just because it's really difficult to predict how anyone will respond to this. David Tibet's incredibly strange presence as a frontman who delivers mostly spoken word vocals, not really actually singing, and the strange writing style, the sort of apocryphal kind of apocalyptic vibe this band always gives off. But If a City is Set Upon a Hill is really unique just because this album, I feel like, really embodies a sense of almost acceptance of a kind of terrifying religious apocrypha that this band is always obsessed with. It feels like every single album they've released is in one way or another about the end of the world in some form or fashion. And this does too, but it feels less overtly terrifying and dark and more at peace with the idea. And it deals with lots of different themes. I feel like lots of the writing can go over your head, but if you really like study it and really interrogate it, lots of albums are about things like loss, grief, war, religion, child abuse, different things. But on here, it's broadly about power and displacement and feeling a kind of omnipresent, lingering sort of manifestation of grief that is embodied by like many people in a specific place. Kind of topical in a lot of ways, but in a very esoteric kind of way. And what makes this release, other than that sort of like vibe of being a little bit more soothing, is that this is just the most straightforward Current 93 album I've heard. Is that from the like what fans who have heard this are saying, a lot of people are saying that this is some of the best material the band's put out in like the last 20 years. And honestly, the more I've listened to this album as the years gone by, the more I'm inclined to actually agree with that statement. This is one of my favorite releases from the band at this point. I'd say that stuff like the songs There Is No Zodiac, the final track is Set Upon a Hill, are some of the most plainly beautiful tracks David Tibet's ever written. His poetry is as evocative and as transfixing, as beguiling as it's ever been, but it's also mixed with the sort of darkness and esotericism that you would want from a Current 93 album. And the more I listened to this, at first I kind of misjudged this as a very straightforward, accessible release from this band that would be good to recommend to people, but probably wouldn't have the same lasting appeal as some of their more major projects. But the more I've gone back to this, the more I appreciate the fact that Current 93 are a band that they do very specific things, but as the years have gone on, they do those things better than fucking anybody. And on this album, they are at the height of their powers production wise. If anything, listen to this purely because it is one of the best sounding albums of 2022, bar none. This is an outstanding album, I think, and just more people need to hear it in general.
My number 4 pick for my list is certainly the most recently released album on my list. In fact, this album, at the time we're recording this, only came out just over a week ago. And I discovered it through a recommendation from our friend Connor. We were having a conversation as I listened to this. And it's interesting because this record, which is the album Hypochondriac from the artist Brakence, this record is a part of a particularly nascent wave of both emo and underground hip hop. It's essentially an emo rap record, basically, which is a label that comes, I guess, loaded with a lot of particular connotations, given the nature of certain artists who have been associated with this kind of heavily emotional rap, like raps or trap music over the last few years, who've sadly frequently turned out to be maybe not the greatest of human beings, or alternatively have been lovely human beings who unfortunately have been tragically taken from us before their time. So emo rap as a proposition, I think, is kind of loaded and will be difficult for a lot of people to accept. And I wasn't necessarily all that interested in listening to this until it started getting recommendations and praise from people whose opinions really matter to me, friends and critics who I trust. And so Connor and I were having a conversation about this, and it's funny because last year, when Jake, when you and I did this video last year, the most recent addition to my list that I threw in at the last minute before we did that was an album called Frailty by a band called Delete Zeke, who have since renamed themselves Jane Remover and are currently gearing up for what promises to be an incredible album release next year, if the singles so far are anything to go by. But yeah, Jane Remover, formerly Delete Zeke, who I shouted out in the same spot last year, and other bands like Quonic and a number of other projects that I can't remember off the top of my head, who are all very underground, very Bandcampy, very rate your music core sort of thing, kind of emerging from the ether with very little money, often very low production value, and making this new particular brand of emo that is super focused on lo-fi aesthetics and performances that are not necessarily traditionally all that appealing. So Brakence is a 20-year-old artist from Columbus, Ohio, real name Randall Findle, who has kind of emerged. It's not his first record. He's had a couple of records that have flown a little bit under the radar before this, sort of slowly building himself up. But this feels like a particularly momentous release for Randall. It feels like a record where he has honed his talents and his skills as an MC more so than ever before, but quite crucially has absolutely honed his skills as a producer, as a beatsmith, as a general sound artist. The production on this record is insane. I mean, if I were to describe it with a genre tag, I mean, it would be glitch pop or digicore, the kinds of very hyperactive, lo-fi, noisy electronic sounds that you would associate with artists like Jane Remover, for instance, but super, super in your face, full of hyperpop aesthetics, but not sort of leaning into the kind of pitch shifty aspects of hyperpop, more just in terms of the maximalist electronica aspects of it, not a million miles away from how someone like Arca would produce. And you have this glitchy pop sort of basis for these frankly hot bars that Randall is delivering. I'm not going to say he's one of the most technically proficient or gifted or mind-blowing MCs or anything like that. I mean, the limits of his talents are, I think, fairly clear, but he has a laser focus in the way he performs. He's very consistently captivating as a performer and as a personality, I think. And the way in which he performs and basically brushes up against these incredibly noisy soundscapes, I find to be quite exciting and original and very much different from other forms of emo rap or emo trap that we've been given before. It feels like that whole aesthetic is completely removed from this iteration of it, which owes so much to hyperpop and glitchcore and digicore and all of those fifth wave emo aesthetics that we've talked about on the show. It's just taking all of that shit and moving it into the world of underground hip hop. And so it's a really intriguing proposition that the first time I listened to it, I was particularly taken with the sound of it all and the way in which Randall as a performer kind of fell into these mixes and really kind of accentuated himself with these soundscapes. But the second time, I think I was better able to fully appreciate the fact that this is just a front to back great album. Yeah, it's maybe a little bit too long, and I could maybe have a little bit of minor structural quibbles that aren't all that meaningful to talk about. But overall, the songs here are really compelling and moving, particularly tracks like Deep Fake and Venus Flytrap, which offer, I think, some really incisive and powerful performances from Randall. And generally, I just find it to be a startling and original record. I mean, Ian Cohen of Indiecore said that, half jokingly, I think, that it's kind of like the first sixth wave emo record. And I think his point with that was that it kind of has very little precedent. Like there are, and I already have done this, there are other artists of the underground you can point to as kind of setting the stage for this. But I don't think there's any other artist, and certainly no other sound that exists that combines different influences and different performance styles in the way that Brakence does here with Hypochondriac. It really feels like a breakthrough moment, and it feels like something which may well herald a number of imitators or a number of new artists within this wave. Look, I'll be frank, Jake, I don't expect this to be your cup of tea. I mean, you should check it out, I think, if it intrigues you, but don't go in expecting to be bowled over.
Sounds cool.
It is definitely very, very cool. I don't know if it'll be, I mean, I could be completely wrong. Maybe you'll be all over it. It's definitely something that I think takes a little bit of adjusting to, especially because I mean, when I say emo rap as well, like, I mean, this motherfucker is like, he's rapping his ass off and he is sad as fuck. And it's like, he's not afraid to kind of be garish and to kind of be a little bit, too much at certain times as well. It's weird. He kind of starts off in this more familiar to rap style of being a little bit more braggadocio and being a little bit more sort of like, imposing his performance and his presence. And then as the record goes on, you get into just, some really emotional, hard-hitting stuff. There's just a moment in Argyle later in the record where he's just like, would you fuck off? I don't need your hand. You thought it was love, baby. I was just playing, because he's all in this defense mechanism state after being heartbroken. And he's like, I don't want a girl. I ain't even want a man. I just want to be dead. And when I say it like that, it sounds, rote. It doesn't really sound all that interesting. The way he delivers it, it's like a fucking bar of the year. He's
I was going to say, it sounds acidic. I love
like
it.
He's just, it's got some real it does. It has some real venom to it. It has some real pain to it. It does feel like it captures the sometimes ingratiating, emo trap aspects of artists like, Uzi or whoever that I'm not particularly fond of, but that I see the appeal of, and really just turns up the viscera. And I really enjoy that. I think that it is not going to be for everyone. Absolutely no doubt about that. But it is a very original take on aesthetics that have been kind of plucked from different areas of the underground and are all sort of coalescing here. I don't think it's a perfect album, as I've said. I think a couple of songs could be cut and it could be tightened up a little bit here and there in a few places. But if you're willing to overlook those little things, I think you'll see the significance of what this is and the potential for what it could become. So yeah, my number 4 pick for most overlooked albums of the year. It may well not be overlooked in a few months' time, but it is brand new. And so far, I think it deserves the shout out. Brakence's Hypochondriac, really interesting record.
Right now, as we move into the top 3, I am reminded of how grateful I am that we make lists like this in the first place, because it gives me an opportunity to shout out things that frankly had no chance of making it onto our end of the year list. So I get to be a little bit more liberal in what I talk about. So in my top 3, we start off with something that actually is in my top 10 of the year, that being the artist, of course, Sonhos Tomam Conta, maladaptive daydreaming. We have talked about the Longinus records, people like endlessly on the show. The first of which, of course, being Paranormal's To See the Next Part of the Dream, an album where we were all unified in our praise for it. It was a terrific shoegaze album that sort of felt like it was on the precipice of a new wave in shoegaze, in emo, in just like this whole new world when it came to alternative music. And Sonhos Tomam Conta's previous project, Hypnagogia, came out the same year. And I saw a lot of potential in their sound on that record, but it didn't really leap out at me. There was just a lot of elements to its construction that fundamentally didn't grip me in the same way that something like the Paranormal album did. This, on the other hand, not only gripped me in that same way, but it gripped me more than any of the other Longinus Records projects we've talked about thus far. This is my favorite, because this is a deeply ambitious combination of so many different things. It's shoegaze, it's emo, it's dream pop, it's ambient, it's post-metal, it's noise rock, it's dark ambient. It has so much going for it, and all of it is combined in this beautiful aesthetic unification that feels both seamless and expansive. And throughout the entire hour duration of this record, I am just utterly transfixed by all of it. You're just wrapped in this cocoon of noisier sounds. Like, that's one of the biggest sort of things that this artist embraces on this record, is that it sort of takes the noisier route that To See the Next Part of the Dreams sort of embrace, that really like hard-edged, kind of abrasive, potentially off-putting production can also be found on here, but it's sort of balanced out a little bit more with moments of harsher noise rock, but with moments of really plaintive, sort of absorbing atmosphere. And each of these songs really present it's a journey in and of itself, but it all just fits together remarkably cohesively for how many different sounds that this is playing with. And it ended up being an album that I really loved initially, but I just kept coming back to this over and over and over again because it had something truly special on it. And when you look into the lyricism, I think that's a deeply underrated part of a lot of these records, much like the Paranormal album. You sort of unveil another thing of what makes this special. A lot of themes of isolation, depression, gender identity, feeling displaced. The vocals also are just absolutely spectacular on this. The range on here that's expressed is a lot more, again, expansive than it was on previous projects here. It really just kind of feels like everything artistic inhibition wise is just being let loose. And it hits home in so many different ways. There's so many moments on here that just emotionally go straight for the heart. And on stuff like the closing track, 42 Wallaby Way Sydney, nice Finding Nemo reference there, or the spectacular 7th track on here, Nothing's Gonna Hurt You Anymore. There are moments that are just stark beauty, of like the likes of which I just don't really have a basis for comparison of anything. This has so many moving parts that, again, it is a difficult recommendation. It is big, it is ambitious, it is messy, but it all comes together in a way that works so well and so confidently. And I just, this is an album that, like, I haven't hit it with a perfect score because it feels like it fundamentally is an album that exists in too many different states to be that sort of perfect sort of uniting force. But it's an album I love every bit as much as albums I've given a perfect score to. It's been a real comfort for me in a year that's been as noisy and as dark as this album can be at times. So if you're a fan of this scene at all, and for whatever reason haven't explored this album yet, for the love of God, please do it. And hell, even if you didn't enjoy what you've heard from this scene before, give this a shot because it's got enough going for it that it may bring something to the table that you just didn't get out of any of the other projects. So bravo to Sonhos Tomam Conta for making what is, in my opinion at least, the best one of these projects from any of these artists. And that's saying a lot because they had a phenomenal year this year with artists like Asian Glow and Paranormal's EPs, and which I loved, by the way. So
my number 3 pick is another recent discovery for me, although this album did come out much earlier in the year. And I was a bit aware of it for a while. It's gotten a number of recommendations. It's been on lists, and critics that I respect have touted it as a very important, sort of great and inspiring and creative and all those sorts of things, landmark release. But there's a very good reason why I didn't get to it until recently, and it's because it is 2 hours long. And not only is it 2 hours long, it is a 2-hour-long country record from one Mr. Zach Bryan, American Heartbreak. We actually talked about this, or Jen, a frequent guest on the show, talked about this fairly recently on a recent main episode of our show. And that was another thing that was like, yeah, it prompted me. And I was like, fuck, I really need to get around to actually just carving out the time to spend with this. And I'm going to be real with you. Not only did I listen to this in full in one setting, I listened to it in full a second time later the same day. That's how much I was taken with this. American Heartbreak, I mean, I don't even know where to even start with reference points or things like that. I mean, in some ways, I guess it reminds me a little bit of the Magnetic Fields 69 love songs in terms of just like the sheer scope of it. But it also, like, that's a record that's defined by its genre exercises and its weird experimental excursions into different types of music. Whereas this is all fairly uniform Americana country music. There's only maybe one kind of left field genre experiment on this thing. And even that isn't like taking a huge amount of risk. It's very much aesthetically of a piece. It just happens to be 34 country songs across 2 hours of music. And as I was listening to it, I was like, it was a kind of an uphill battle for me, fighting against the instinct of the it's good, but it's too long criticism. And the thing about it is, as I went through this record, and it's like, it feels obvious because this is the experience that everyone who loves this record has described. I found myself completely taken with every single song, maybe borrowing one or two songs that I think could probably have been left on the cutting room floor. Like, for instance, the only cover on this record is a cover of You Are My Sunshine, which I think just doesn't quite fit the mold very well. And it's kind of a testament to Zach, I suppose, that the weakest song on the record is the only one he didn't write. But I mean, that aside, while there are definitely standout songs here, there's absolutely no lowlights among the songs that Zach has written himself. There are a few moments of kind of cheeky, pastiche kind of irreverence that Zach doesn't lean into often, but occasionally he does, like songs like If She Wants a Cowboy or Whiskey Fever, which are kind of a bit more on the sillier side of things, but still kind of, I find, a bit to be fairly endearing and enjoyable. I swear this isn't bait, Jake, but the artist I was reminded of the most while listening to this was Rustin Kelly. I just felt such a similar vibe in the way that Zach writes as well. I mean, he deliberately evokes other kind of major figures in Americana, like Jason Isbell, in a song like Cold Damn Vampires. I mean, it's a country song with vampires in the title, but it's also a fucking sad one as well. Like, God, I mean, this is the thing, right? Is that, and maybe this is why it appeals to me so much, because I'm still like relatively new to modern country and trying my best to kind of get into the best stuff. I think it helps that, you know, about a good 70-75% of this album at least is very sad and just appeals to that indie rock singer-songwriter side of my tastes that just genuinely likes it when someone who is speaking about being very, very sad or being, you know, unlucky in love or whatever it is able to communicate that in a really potent and concise way. And Zach really is able to do that. I mean, to be fair, it is called American Heartbreak, so it kind of does prime you to be made a little bit sad. And there's bitterness on this album as well. There's more than one album's fair share of bitter breakup songs as well. But there's also plenty of really endearing and affecting little love songs dotted throughout this as well. And as the record goes on as well, you get a preponderance of songs that feel almost like Springsteen, Nebraska-esque. Not necessarily in terms of storytelling, but just in how like kind of emotionally compelling they are. Songs like Someday, Maggie's, and Open the Gate, and From Austin, and No Cure, and the absolutely brutal penultimate song here, Morning Time. I mean, you just get more and more of these absolutely fantastically well-written and emotionally evocative songs. Billy Stay is another great one. High Beams, Younger Years, Tisha Mingo. I mean, the whole fucking album is just stacked. It's an exercise in sheer nerve and confidence in his own songwriting as well. It's also worth noting that despite the fact that Zach has put 34 songs on this album, he's also released 4 singles, I think, since the release of this that aren't on this record, all of which, if they were on this record, would be in the top 10 songs. Like, this man has fucking bangers and heartbreakers that are too good for his 34 song album. I don't even know how to process that. All I know how to do is listen to this fucking thing. Songs like Something in the Orange, Heavy Eyes, which is just one of the most fucking hard fucking banger Americana songs I've heard in a long time. I already mentioned Younger Years as well. Oklahoma City, fucking The Good Old Dude. Jesus, and then it ends quite affectingly and unexpectedly with this very fragile spoken word piece at the end of the record that kind of made me feel things I wasn't expecting to feel. It's kind of a little bit, sort of teenage diary poetry spoken word, but Zach, he really sells it. Like, it feels like this moment of, just Zach fully embracing the extra motherfucker that he is. And I don't know, I just think that if you enjoy modern singer-songwriter artists who frequently lean into Americana and country aesthetics and the things they do, and I don't even need to say who I'm implicitly referring to here, then you will enjoy this. I mean, it's everything you could possibly want from what the record sets out to do. It doesn't disappoint in any way. I mean, yeah, the first time you listen to it, there might be songs that feel a little bit inessential compared to others, but as it goes on, you get a fuller picture of the whole thing, and you kind of start to value the less essential moments. And there's certainly nothing on here that even vaguely approaches middling, apart from the aforementioned Sunshine cover. It's just great. It's great stuff.
We love the big mess here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Zach could have easily just made this 3 distinct different albums, but it wouldn't have been the same. And I really admire and I'm fully behind the decision to make this sprawling fucking just, ridiculously long collection of great songs. I mean, there is at least 8 or 9 songs on here that I feel are good enough to be future standards. And the fact that I can even say that about a record is, it's a special thing. And Zach is an inarguable talent who is clearly operating at the height of his powers. I cannot wait to see what he does next. And I mean, if anyone out there is like me, who's been sort of looking for a way to get into the actually good and powerful and meaningful and undersung artists in modern country, Zach's clearly one of them. I'm glad he's starting to get the attention he deserves for this project, even if I feel like maybe part of the motivation behind making this as long as it was just to get attention so that people would actually focus on him and how good he is as a songwriter. And if you got to do that, if you got to do a gimmick like make a 34 song album and you have the songs to back it up, then go for it. Like, yeah, obviously.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, for sure. I see on his Wikipedia and his Rate Your Music page, he already has a new album teed up for next year. It doesn't have a release date yet, but I for sure am going to be there on day one to see what Zach is dishing up. So yeah, that's my number 3 pick for
What's he cooking?
What's he cooking in there?
All right, my penultimate pick here for this list is my number 4 album of the year. Easily my pick for the most underrated and overlooked album of the year, like full stop. Because this is, thankfully, it is doubled the amount of ratings that it's gotten since I initially spoke about it on the podcast, which is very, very nice to see. But this is the artist Autonoesis, the black metal band Autonoesis, their album Moon of Foul Magics, their second album after their self-titled in 2020, which was a terrific album that showed a whole lot of promise. And I feel like all of that promise and more is delivered on Moon of Foul Magics. This is a synthesis of so many different kinds of extreme music that I adore. This has the sort of proggy, winding black metal that, you know, European bands like Moonsorrow have, that I really, really love. It has the blackened thrash of stuff like early Bathory albums mixed with a hearty dose of stuff like Megadeth on songs like Raise the Dead. It has a kind of Opeth-like dark folk vibe to it that's showcased on songs like Exile and Valhalla, and just generally speaking has some of the most fully fleshed out metal songs I've heard in some time. These are holistic. They are never single-minded. They are always in service of creating a journey. And this is 66 minutes of straight fucking heat the whole way through. This is one of the most beautiful sounding black metal albums, probably since the Panopticon album last year, that manages to have these crescendos and energy that are just positively blissful on songs like On Black Wings of Eternity and Descending the Void, songs that just pummel you and build and rise and build and just hit over and over again until they climax beautifully, and it is a sight to behold. Everything on here is just so thoroughly consistent, thoroughly excellent, and it's a combination of a whole lot of things, but it's a whole lot of things that you don't ever get synthesized together. This kind of hard-edged black metal mixed with the sort of progressive death metal stylings is just not an aesthetic combination that you see undertaken a whole lot. And for it to be executed with this kind of creative verve, it's just fucking stunning. Every time I come back to this thing, it absolutely floors me. I just sit there, riff after riff after riff. I'm just fucking flabbergasted that that shit even exists at all. And for what it seems like, people who are interested in stuff like this seems to be like a universal hit amongst them. So please, by all means, if any of this sounds even remotely interesting to you, if you like any of the things that I've listed, if you're an Opeth fan, if you're a Moonsorrow fan, if you like Bathory, hell, even if you like something a little bit more mainstream like Megadeth, there is something to love on here. And this band have, like, they just don't have a huge following. They, again, 600 ratings on this album, which is a miracle considering. Go support them on Bandcamp. You can get both of their albums for free, and that's, considering the level of quality, I think that's kind of insane. Throw a buck or two their way. They are more than deserving of it. This is some of the most creative and exciting extreme music I've heard that isn't on the Longinus label. And that's just stupendously exciting that music like this can still excite me after I've, listened to albums like Still Life or Umaltan Ica 7,000 times. So just please listen to this. My God.
All right. My number 2 pick. I mean, I'm on brand. I'm on a certain brand with this in my last pick on this list, because this is a 2 hour and 40 minute album. but very much not a country record, very different. We're moving all the way across the world to South Korea and to a jazz pop artist by the name of YAYA Kim. And she put out an album called a.k.a. YAYA way back in January of this year. I discovered it very early in the year. And while there are a select handful, and I don't mean there's not very many, there's a select handful of albums I like more than this, or I admire more than this year. There is no album that I've heard this year that is more impressive in terms of the variety and diversity of what it achieves than this record. This is a 3-disc epic where across each of the 3 discs, YAYA completely commits herself to completely different genre exercises. And she describes essentially what you can expect on the Bandcamp page for the album. The first disc is like it's jazz pop and funk with a bit of a trip hop edge and a rock edge. The second disc is new tango rock and much jazzier. And then the third disc is like classic crossover world music with an avant-garde twist. Like each disc is about 50 odd minutes, has a completely different personality, right? So it's essentially 3 albums packaged together into one. And the level of versatility that she displays across these 3 discs is fucking staggering. Like she is continually you hear of artists that reinvent themselves across their career and make records in different genres and showcase the skill and aptitude in so many different arenas of music. YAYA does that on this album across these 3 different discs, completely reinventing her identity as an artist as this record goes on. And by the end of it, you have been taken on a whirlwind tour of like all different forms of world music, of soul music, of funk music, of trip hop, of jazz, of pop, and many of it very Eastern in feel, right? So you're definitely getting a much needed escape from very westernized versions of these sounds. And so it all feels very unique. And the key thing is that it all fucking knocks. Like YAYA very seldom, if ever, fails in anything that she attempts. And frequently she delivers blistering and powerful performances, both vocally and in terms of the music that her band are able to conjure here, in ways that are just totally staggering. I mean, it's hard for me to really sell this enough without just leaning into how impressive it all is in terms of its sheer achievement. Every time you listen to this, if you can make it through it more than once, because it is long, but every time I have listened to this, a different one of the 3 discs has been my favorite. And that is something really special, I think. Initially, I think I was really attracted more to the slightly familiar rockier edge of the first disc. Like there was some fucking hard as hell songs that just bang on that motherfucking disc. But then I have been taken more and more by the unique jazz influences and sort of South American flavor of the second disc, and then the completely freeform bizarro nature of the third disc, which is probably the biggest grower and maybe the least immediate set of songs here, but certainly ends the record in a place where you feel like, Jesus Christ, anything is possible for this artist, and you have no idea where she will go next. I kind of been surprised by how little attention I've seen this get outside of like incredibly online music communities. I would have thought that given the nature of the different things that YAYA does on this album, that it might attract a little bit more critical attention. But this one's really fallen under the radar in a way that has been really kind of sad to see, given how much of a career summation masterpiece it feels like it is. So if you are at all put off by the length of this thing, YAYA herself encourages you to treat it as 3 very distinct discs that have their own identity. So if it's easier for you to experience it in that format, just try things out. It helps that the most accessible disc is the first one. Try it out, see what you think. I would be very surprised if you weren't instantly taken by it just for how fresh and invigorated and exciting it sounds. Then you can go further into disc 2 and disc 3 and see the new and exciting things that YAYA brings to the table deeper into this thing. I mean, we've had a lot of artists this year and in recent years, mostly Western American or UK artists, who have explored, you know, the non-American, non-UK genres and forms of music, and have kind of incorporated a little bit more into their takes on rock music or folk music or whatever. But it's really something to hear, and it's really unique to hear someone just fully dive deep into so many different genres and styles and completely pull it off across the board the way that YAYA does on this project. So yeah, 100% gets my highest recommendation. One of the year's most impressive albums.
All right, top of the list time. My number one pick is the only one of the 3 albums that I awarded a perfect score to this year that did not make our end of the year list. That being Shape of Despair's Return to the Void. Now, this album is maybe one of the most inaccessible, unfriendly genres of music out there, that of funeral doom metal. Funeral doom metal is the darkest, slowest, often most minimal, most compositionally stagnant forms of doom metal. So I can't exactly say that my recommendation for people to listen to this is really all that enthusiastic, because it's something that I can just see not a whole lot of people really vibing with from the outset, frankly. But a lot of what makes this album and what makes this band, which I've really dived into after being taken with this album, really special, is the sort of lingering omnipresence of the subgenre of ethereal wave, which is often a sort of subgenre that is included with dream pop. You know, you see that with lots of tags for Cocteau Twins, or even the new Ethel Cain album, for instance. And their incorporation of this element of their sound adds a sort of incredible dense atmosphere that, while most funeral doom metal albums like, say, Bell Witch's Mirror Reaper kind of go for a sort of stark, spacious vibe, this, on the other hand, goes for an almost smothering suffocation. And again, what makes that further interesting is the sort of gothic edge to this sound. There are both male and female clean sung vocals on here that are not just the traditional death metal growling, which does show up on here, but it stands in stark contrast to the clean vocals, which are often loud, expressive, deeply, deeply haunting, and just longing expressions of just, you know, a lot of this album is difficult to talk about just because it's a lot of difficult subject matter that it covers. A lot of it is about suicidality. A lot of it is about just the embrace of the end. And it comes to a complicated conclusion where there is a sort of resolute peace that's found at the end of all of the suffering that is taking place on here. But it's not necessarily good or bad. It always leaves me feeling kind of emotionally complicated about the whole thing. And just every single song on this album, start to finish, is just so wholly captivating. It's so wholly moving to me. Everything on here, from the title track, which is a phenomenal opener, to the almost dirgy quality of something like Reflection and Slow Time, or Solitary Downfall, or the song Forfeit, the penultimate track, which has one of the most stunning endings of any metal song all year. And this has just been an album that I've come back to that's become perversely kind of a comfort to me. And I can't really explain how. It's just an album that manages to sort of crush all of the small things at the peripheral of my brain and just kind of leave me with a sense of peace. It just kind of quiets the noise of everything around me in a way that, you know, not a lot of doom metal has. I'd say that this is affecting in a very similar way that the Pallbearer album in 2020 was, except this album feels like its focus with its sound, its atmosphere, its focus on that sort of ethereal quality really lends it an edge that a lot of doom metal just doesn't have these days, and their catalog has as a whole. They're a really interesting band, Shape of Despair. There's a sort of covers EP that they have that I listened to, where they actually ended up covering a band that dabbles in the dark wave, ethereal wave sort of genre that I've talked about on here before, Lycia. And their sort of covering of a Lycia song really makes a whole lot of sense, because I feel like spiritually they share a whole lot in common. And hell, their previous album, Monotony Fields, a phenomenal album, feels like doom metal by like, or really it feels like ambient music by way of doom metal. It's so focused on less on impact and more like getting you caught up in this sort of ocean of sound. And the way it conveys its scale and the sort of dramatic, gothic quality that it has, it feels like such a definitive arrival of a sound that I just haven't heard anyone heartily embrace in the same way I have here, with this just utter confidence. And I found it to be really comforting. I found it to be really unsettling, and it's just a work of art that I found profoundly moving each time I've experienced it. And it's really helped me this year in a way that not a lot of metal albums do, but it's maybe the most cathartic thing I've listened to all year. And like the Autonoesis album, it's sitting at a meager 600 ratings. And again, this is a record I think that is deserving of far, far more than that. So I like, even less so than the Autonoesis album, this is not going to be a lot of people's bag. But at this moment in time, I think I would consider this to be my favorite doom metal album. And knowing me, that's a genre I spend a lot of time with. So that's not something I would say lightly.
Yeah, I listened to this again recently. It's growing on me. It's definitely an intense experience. In fact, one of the things that I think held me at a distance from it initially was not just that, oh, it's not my musical bag, it's my yada yada. It's just that it's so intense. Like, there's just a crushing feeling to it that I don't think I really even knew how to comprehend the first time I heard it. I will say that particularly the song Forfeit has really stayed with me throughout this year. And every time I come back to that track, that one in particular, I think is the one that, and just the beauty of that song, and just it's a great track, and it's a record that I do really, really like, and I'm going to continue to come back to it when I'm in the headspace to be so brutally demolished.
There are moments on here where I think the vocals really are a thing that make this album have a sense of variety that a lot of albums like it don't have. And there's moments on this album that really stick with me, where just the music will just, the instrumental will just entirely cut out, and it'll just be like the female vocals just vocalizing. And that shit is just like, that's the most powerful music that I've heard all year long on any album.
Well, moving to my number one, and actually it's not a doom metal record, but it's from a band that started out as a doom metal band, a British band called 40 Watt Sun, who initially, with their 2011 album The Inside Room, were doom metal. They were this intriguing fusion of doom metal and like slowcore and sort of depressive indie music. So like, they're basically a depressive indie slowcore band, but just lathered in doom metal aesthetics and crushing riffs. And over the years, what they've done is they've kind of pared back the doom metal aspect, and they've focused in on purely being a slowcore band. 2016's Wider Than the Sky was the big sort of shift. There still was a sense of scale to their arrangements on that record that suggested where they had come from, but they were definitely moving away from metal at that point. And then in January of this year, it's actually quite funny that my two most overlooked albums of the year both came out in January. So in January of this year, this band put out the record that I discovered them with, which is an album called Perfect Light. This album is probably the record this year that has emotionally devastated me the most. which is kind of fitting because that's a theme.
To say common thread here.
For our number one picks is emotionally devastating records from doom metal or former doom metal bands. It's actually kind of difficult to talk about this album. I will talk about it. I've prepared myself mentally for it, but it definitely took me a bit because it's like I discovered this early in the year. I don't want to get like biographical here because it gets away from the music itself, but like I discovered this early in the year and I loved it then and it moved me and it was beautiful. And then it's like so much of the emotion and the sadness and the grief that this frontman of this band, Patrick Walker, sings about on this album kind of just happened to me in some form or another throughout the year as it went on. It's been a year of loss in like literally at least half a dozen different ways for me. And this album has been a constant all throughout, but it's also been something that has felt really personal to me. And, you know, if you follow me on Twitter, I'm always posting songs of shit and I'm always like getting in my feelings and shit and posting music I'm listening to. But I seldom, I have seldom just freewheelingly posted about this record because it's just something that when I'm listening to it, I'm having an immensely personal and intimate experience. One of my favorite musical experiences this year actually was early in the year after I first discovered it when I recommended it to our friend Jacob. And then we just listened to it together one night. Like it was really late in the middle of the night and we were just listening to it at the same time and it was beautiful. And yeah, and so this is a record where if I were to describe the appeal of it, I've already described it as a slowcore record, but it's not necessarily like low slowcore in the sense that it's like monotonous, one or two notes alternating and this very kind of grim tone. It's actually a very conventionally beautiful record that has a little bit more in common with the Red House Painters brand of slowcore, where it's like a lot of major chords, a lot of twinkly and bright sounds. And vocally and lyrically, I'm reminded most of Jason Molina, the dearly departed artist behind the records of Songs Ohia and the Magnolia Electric Company. Partly because Patrick Walker, the frontman of this band, has a voice that reminds me very much of Jason Molina. It's this kind of world-weary voice of someone who feels like they're 1,000 years old and they've lived through ages and ages. And the primary descriptor of the lyricism and vocal delivery of this album is weary. This man is tired, but not in a way where he feels lethargic in how he sings, but in how he feels as though he is dealing with the weight of the world as he writes these songs. They are patient songs. I mean, this is a nearly 70-minute record, and a lot of the songs are 8, 9, up to 11 minutes long. They don't have a lot of development. They are slow moving. They are beautiful. The guitars are never less than staggeringly gorgeous. And the lyricism is breathtaking. I mean, I have to read some of these lyrics, I think, to kind of give you an impression of Patrick as a songwriter and how and why the records affected me. But it's actually really difficult to do that. A lot of this album is about loss. It's about grief. It's about, you know, the feeling I get listening to this is someone who is like sleepless in the middle of the night, sitting over the grave of someone they've lost and just kind of trying to be as close to the memory of them as possible. You live in everything I love and everything I'll never be. You're traced in everything I touch. You are the rhythm of my days and the spaces in between. The darkness I defined has not forgotten me, but ever presses closer the bounds of my reach. Tonight I will not try to harden truth with reasons. A silence says it all. It comes to remind me who I am. I carried more than your love. That's not what I was weary of. I could live with any amount if I could learn to live with myself. I mean, shit like this is the kind of stuff that makes you want to just pack your bag and leave your life behind. That's how sad this shit is. But it also, like, it lets you get close to and confront things that are really hard to understand, to rationalize, to articulate. And it's so poetic and thoughtful in the way that it communicates these feelings and these experiences. Songs like Reveal, the opening track on this record, is such an immediate comfort. I mean, immediately he's just reaching out to you and he's fucking hugging you. Whatever you've lost, whatever you leave, whatever your lonely, stifled need, whenever the night is tightening, wherever you are, the light will reach. Whatever you touch, whatever you feel, whatever the cut that life won't heal, however wide the silence seems, wherever you want me, I will be. I will hear you. I will cross the distance in your eyes. Those are the opening lines of this album, right? So you're already...
That's vicious.
Yeah, and it's like he brings you in, he lets you be vulnerable, he holds you, and then together as the album goes on, you go with him into your grief, and you spend time in that space, and you get to be grieving and not be alone. And that's it's... I mean, I'm sure there's probably loads of records that is a fitting way of describing, but there's certainly none I've experienced this year that feel as intimate in how they do that as this does. I mean, it's like an album where, you know, every fucking verse or couplet is like something you immediately hear and want to get tattooed on your body. Like, that's just how instantly perfect it all feels. And it's just weary, like I said, and it's just full of the weight of a long life and a lot of loss. And it is therapeutic in a way that very few records I can think of are to this extent. You feel held. I feel held by this album. And I think if anyone out there, without trying to sound all, you know, fucking bleeding heart, but if anyone is looking for something, a piece of art that can make them feel that way, I couldn't recommend anything better than this. And on that incredibly emotionally crushing weight from both of us, those are the most overlooked albums of 2022, and there were, believe me, many others that firmly deserved spots in here as well. It was hard to kind of rationalize.
There were so many great albums this year, honestly. Like, we could have made this list twice as long as it could have been and had just as much material to work with. Like, I don't think it had this year had as many high points, like you know, mountainous high points as last year did. But in terms of just overall great records, I think there was even more of them this year.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a stellar year, and we want to hear from you. What do you think at home were some of the most overlooked records of this year that you've been loving and you've been wishing got a little bit more shine? Please let us know in the comments below, and we will check them out. We want to hear what you think the most overlooked records of the year are, because, you know, it's all great to talk about, you know, consensus things we agree on as greatest records of the year that are deservingly celebrated and that we get to look back on and think of as defining aspects of the year. But it can be even more meaningful to share with someone in something that has fallen between the cracks. So let us know what you think those records are for you personally. And check these albums out, of course, as well. I'll make sure that there are links to the records, particularly the ones that are available primarily via Bandcamp. I'll make sure those links are in the description of this video. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and hitting the subscribe button if you haven't done that already. If you want to, of course, if you enjoyed this and if you want to stay tuned for our future music list videos, of which there will be many. If you want to go above and beyond and become a member of the Jams and Tea family, you can hit the join button for just $1 a month. Support us directly, get your name in the title call of each video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us a record to listen to and feedback on, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. As always, though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Taco Bell. Think outside the bun.